Hello, my name is Elizabeth Laufenberg, and this is my research study where I tried to look and determine whether technology can bridge the achievement gap. This particular study focuses on the achievement gap between African American and white students. Despite a strong beginning to educational equality with the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954 and 1955, an achievement gap does still exist. An achievement gap is usually identified as a severe underperformance in education or in educational tasks by one group compared to another group. The most frequently mentioned gaps in achievement exist between rich and poor students, as well as white and black students. So in this particular study, I wanted to take a look at what some of the experts say about the achievement gap. And one of the things that I looked at were some theories as to why this achievement gap exists. One of the theories pertains to elements of African American culture. And this is based on a study of Zora Neale Hurston's, A. Wade Boykins, and Donald Y. Ford's research into African American culture. And an interesting element of the culture, or one of the ways that this culture might affect the achievement gap, is a quality that is called drama by Hurston and called verve by Boykin. And then in Ford's research, she referred to it as lively and energetic interactions with peers and teachers. The reason that this can influence the achievement gap is because teachers tend to prefer their classrooms to be nicely controlled. So the teachers get frustrated with this verve, and then the student gets bored, and of course the result is low academic achievement. A second theory as to why the achievement gap exists is because of our current focus on text-based learning. As we know, our standards are very textually focused, and a focus on text-based learning is not in league with what we already know about today's millennial learners, who seem to be more visually oriented and less likely to spend time reading. And so that can also cause the achievement gap to grow rather than to diminish. Finally, a resource gap can be a reason that the achievement gap is not closing. And in this case, with this particular study, I focused on unequal access to technology. Schools with high African American populations and high poverty have the least access to technology, and so that exacerbates the achievement gap or causes it to continue. Then I decided I wanted to look at what some of the research or some of the literature said about blended learning. First of all, the research suggests that blended learning improves student performance. Students with access to educational technology perform better than those who do not have such access. An example is an elementary school in California, and this elementary school had a population that was 95% free and reduced lunch and 90% English as a second language. And this school incorporated a blending learning curriculum and saw a 53% increase in the number of students who were reading at grade level. There were several other studies that I came across in the literature as well that supported this outcome. Another thing I discovered about blended learning is that it has a cool factor, which means students like to learn through technology. They like to use computers. They think it's cool. And African American adolescents are often forced to choose between academic excellence and peer popularity, and so using the blended learning curriculum can often help them make that choice toward academic excellence. Additionally, blended learning has the potential to reduce segregation in the classroom, which is always a good thing. And it may be that online learning gives a different visual image for African American masculinity, because it can help them see they have that particular cool factor option learning through the technology. And they may decide to cultivate a more intellectual identity. Again, as I researched blended learning, I came across the resource gap. And of course, access to technology is access to information. And so African American students who are already at a resource disadvantage are further harmed by a lack of access to technology. And the main reason that schools don't incorporate blended learning policies is because of a lack of financing. And so some BYOD, or bring your own device policies, have been incorporated in some schools. This is where the students are allowed to bring their own mobile devices and use those mobile devices in the classroom for their own technological use. Mobile devices enhance classroom environments, and African American students view using devices as a reward and also as motivation for completing classwork. And an interesting fact that I found is that blacks and whites are equally likely to own a cell phone of some kind. So it may be that this digital type of learning is a great equalizer in the classroom. So going through the literature and reading the work that has been done on both blended learning and the achievement gap, I came to this research question. Can blended learning in the English language arts classroom bridge the achievement gap between African American high school males and their white counterparts? My hypothesis is that yes, it can. Before I continue, I want to be sure that you know what I am saying or what I mean when I say certain terms. The term blended learning refers to a curriculum that is 50% computer-based and 50% face-to-face instruction with a highly qualified English language arts teacher. The blended learning track that I refer to is a track of English language arts courses that are taught by teachers who incorporate blended learning in their classroom. Of course, the non-blended learning track is a sequence of English language arts classes that are not taught by teachers who incorporate blended learning. When I refer to a cohort, I am referring to a group of African American high school boys who will begin in 9th grade with them, and we will continue with this same group of boys through 10th grade and 11th grade on a blended learning track in English language arts. And just in case anybody doesn't know what ELA means, sometimes I'll say ELA. It stands for English Language Arts, or sometimes just called English. The study is a longitudinal quantitative study following the test scores of a cohort of African American boys starting when they are in 9th grade and ending during their senior year. Oops. The cohort will be initially randomly chosen from students, African American students who are placed randomly in 9th grade English language arts classes with teachers who incorporate blended learning into their coursework. Control groups, 3 control groups will also be randomly chosen each year. There will be a control group of African American boys at the same grade level who are not in blended learning. There will be a control group of white boys who are in blended learning, and there will be a control group of white boys who are not in blended learning. And these control groups will be randomly selected. They will also contain the same number of students as are in the cohort, and attempts will be made to allow for stratified sampling regarding socioeconomic status and access to technology at home. Initial calculation of the achievement gap will come from their 8th grade English language arts standardized test scores. What I will do is look or compare the mean scores for the total African American population to the mean scores of the total white population, and that will give us the achievement gap. And then just to further secure that, the mean scores of the cohort will then be compared to the mean scores of the total African American population and adjusted using one-way ANOVA. The instrument used to collect the data will be the state-mandated English Language Arts end-of-course standardized tests at 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade levels, and the scores will be recorded and analyzed comparatively at the end of each grade level. In this study, we will have one dependent variable, the achievement gap, between these African American boys in the blended learning track compared to the African American boy control group in the non-blended learning track, the white control group in the blended learning track, and the white control group that is in the non-blended learning track. 2 independent variables exist. One is whether or not the students are on the blended learning track. The second is race, and that is an ex post facto variable. The scores will be converted to z-scores. The Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, or the Pearson R, will then be calculated, and this will show how the scores for each group correlate. If the hypothesis is valid, the scores should show a strong negative relationship between blended learning English language arts classes and the achievement gap. In other words, As the number of blended learning English language arts classes increases, the achievement gap decreases. I predict that this study will take about 4 years to complete. We need the students to have time to get through 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade, and then it isn't entirely unheard of for their scores at the end of 11th grade to not come back until sometime in their senior year. So we need to allow for that extra year to get all the scores back. As with any study, this study also has limitations. One of those limitations is the fact that it will be difficult to separate teacher effect from blended learning effect. Most teachers who are willing to incorporate blended learning in their class are flexible and motivated to do what's best for their students anyway, and these are already highly effective teachers. So it will be difficult to determine whether the achievement gap diminished as a result of effective teaching rather than blended learning opportunities. A second limitation is finding the right site. We need to have a school that has a large enough African American population to make it statistically significant, and also it needs to have some English language arts teachers who use blended learning and some English language arts teachers who don't use blended learning. And I think we can probably figure that out, but it may take a little bit of work to find exactly the right site. It is my hope that this particular study will help determine best practices for bridging the achievement gap. Also, I hope that it brings blended learning into the forefront of educational research as a valid tool for helping all students reach their highest potential. Are there any questions?
Go ahead, please. Are there any expenses involved in this research?
Not as much as you might think. The state already pays for the state-mandated testing to be done, and the researcher will do the crunching of the data to determine whether or not or just to manage the scores, to analyze the scores.
How many subjects do you plan to recruit?
I think the sample size is probably going to end up being determined by the number of African American students who are randomly placed in a 9th grade English language arts class with a teacher who incorporates blended learning.
Now, have you considered, and I guess this goes back to your site, like finding the right site, is like how to keep the participants you select in 9th grade in the same learning style classroom over the 3-year period?
That is definitely tricky. You'd have to have the cooperation of the administrator in charge of scheduling, who would then, once they are randomly selected, these are my cohort, who would then schedule them intentionally with teachers who incorporate blended learning into the classroom.
Are you going to recruit the same number of African American males as white males? Like, will you have the same number?
That is the initial idea, to have the same number in all 4 groups with stratified sampling to make sure, to help balance out whether students are economically disadvantaged or whether they have technology at home.
I have one last one. Have you considered adding like a qualitative component like interviewing or observation to maybe eliminate the bias or tease out that idea of like teacher effect or devices at home, so that maybe you could in your findings like speak into, so this is what I think is really happening, looking at the data, these things seem to come up. Or have you thought about adding a qualitative element maybe when you more fully flesh this out in later coursework?
Yes, actually, I think this is probably something that could definitely become a qualitative study.
Or mixed methods.
Or mixed methods. I would be very interested in learning how students' emotions and feelings and social securities and insecurities influence the achievement gap. And so if I were going to incorporate qualitative studies, that's where I would go with that particular question.
Sounds awesome.
It's a good job.
Yay.